Good morning and welcome to this weekend's edition of News from the Camp House, the listening post of the Texas Sportsman Association. This is Herman Brune, and this week's edition is also brought to us by the Shaw's Bend Social Club, country club for folks who don't have a country club. All right, tell you what, we've got a gentleman with us today who is the leading authority on the North American Wildlife Conservation Model, Shane Mahoney. Shane, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you today?
Well, sneaking along. Okay, now, yeah, I'm trying to do right, but anyway, I've had, questions brought up because I've always advocated, promoted the North American Wildlife Conservation Model. We used it as a big point, recruiting point for our Texas Outdoor Writers Association. And in the old 1957 mission statement from our Outdoor Writers Association, it says that they would promote and advocate the 1937 Wildlife Reclamation Act. Now, the question I had was, when was the moniker, the name of it, the 37 Act gave it financial teeth. It gave it a way to survive. But when did we actually hear the words North American Wildlife Conservation Model uttered?
The words themselves in that term first appeared in the early to mid 1990s, and they were articulated by the man who actually wrote the term itself, and also who sort of articulated the 7 principles that we identify with respect to the North American model. The term became, better refined, if you will, and better defined over the next approximately decade. And by about 2001, 2002, of course, the term started to find its way into discussions and channels and meetings and conferences and, discussions within wildlife agencies and so on and so forth. But it really was not until that time period, the mid-1990s approximately, that we started to see the genesis of this term, which a lot of people find very interesting because now it is very much commonplace, certainly within the sustainable use community, and the federal and state agencies, and NGOs that are part of that community. And many people assume that it was probably around a lot longer. Now, it's important to point out, that of course, the principles, the ideas, the contents, if you will, of what's known as the North American model were in existence, right?
Right.
But the concept was never brought together, defined, and really given legs until that time period, from the mid-1990s to the early part of the 2000s.
Okay. Well, I was, because I have always said, it started with Roosevelt, started at the turn of the century, people started seeing that, there had to be some type of a conservation model. And I, without really doing the research on it, I was kind of under the impression that it was an ongoing model prior to 37, and that the 1937 Wildlife Reclamation Act gave it a funding mechanism that solidified it and made it, made it what it is now. Of course, all the tenets were in place at that time, but the exact verbiage wasn't applied. Now what I'm hearing is until early to mid 1990s, huh?
That's correct. And it's important for people to realize that when we talk about the North American model, another word that's sort of adjacent to that or akin to that would be the North American approach to wildlife conservation, because how we have approached that in the United States and in Canada, which sort of shared this model, is different from other approaches, such as in Europe, for example, Brazil or in Southern Africa or in South America, And so the model is really a moniker that describes the system of policies and laws and institutions that have over time, beginning with the big revolution that you refer to in the Rooseveltian years, the Theodore Rooseveltian years, that over time coalesced into what we recognize as a definable North American approach. And really the model, of course, is driven by the sustainable use movement, by the regulated harvest of wildlife and fish populations, and all of the institutions, policies, and laws, and funding mechanisms that adhere to that. I think it's important, right, to note that the North American model of conservation, as we talk about it, really is focused on the major aspects of conservation that sort of are related to the sustainable use, the hunting and angling aspects of conservation. There are other elements, there are national parks, there are other elements, of course, that are contained overall within the idea of broader conservation principles. But the North American model really has helped explain, how we came to rescue wildlife, particularly the hunted species, how we came to establish, our wildlife agencies, our state and our provincial agencies and so on, how we raised money to conserve wildlife, all of the enforcement aspects that adhere to hunting and fishing regulations, etc. So it's important that people think about it and think about the tenets, the 7 tenets that are so well articulated now, that they also think more broadly and realize, just how many, institutions, the Wildlife Society, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, the Wildlife Management Institute, et cetera, plus all the critter agencies, if you would call them that, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, pheasants, and so on and so forth, the Wild Sheep Foundation, and then all of the very, very pro-hunting organizations, the Safari Club, for example, etc., organizations like that really place hunting at its core. All of those things and all the laws and all the policies for the states and provinces, really derive from the principles of the model, but they're now all part of the model too. In other words, the model could not work without state and provincial agencies, and without wildlife societies, and without wildlife management institutes, and so on. So, important for the audience to understand that all of that now really is in a basket that we label the North American model.
Okay. All right. That's a good point that, kind of everybody's in this thing together. Yes, and I know I've had those discussions with various leaders, Parks and Wildlife, and I've always said, yes, well, the funding mechanism certainly from the 37 Reclamation Act certainly helped the states have a foothold in how to manage it's a little bit confusing because you have all these tenets that were in place, and now all of a sudden you've got a name for it. And I think that's why I have always advocated that this should be in curriculum, because if you've got a name for something, then it makes it more understandable instead of just a big basket full of tenets and say, well, we do all these things, and we just do all these things. Because I've talked to wildlife biologists, and when I bring up that conservation model, they kind of give me a blank stare. And I'm kind of like, well, everybody should at least know about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't agree more. And I think you're absolutely right that one of the great contributions that Dr. Geist made, he didn't claim to have created the tenets or created all the institutions and policies and laws. He just gave it a name. And it's an interesting story, because the reason he gave it a name was because he thought there were threats to the approach that we had taken and which had been so successful in North America, beginning with the, Roosevelt and Grinnell and Pinchot and all of those famous people we remember 100 to 125 years ago. That he thought this was being placed at risk, and he was challenged that when he said we had a system, as he first said, we have a system in place, and he was challenged to say, well, really, you have a system in North America for wildlife conservation? Well, what is that system? And it was out of that kind of challenge that he eventually sat down and eventually articulated the North American model with its tenets. And I think you're quite right, that having a term like the North American model, with all the complexities that hang underneath it, like the tentacles from the jellyfish,
Yeah.
Having that name is incredibly important because it allows people to say in shorthand something about a very complicated matrix of things that are actually operating to secure wildlife's future.
Right. We're going to reiterate that in the second half. I tell you what, let's take a quick break and thank the folks who let us come on here every Saturday morning. We'll be right back.